Welcome back, everyone. Applying behavioral insights and nudge to education is the subject of this panel that will be moderated by Mrs. Maha Haidar Makki, co-founder of Nudge Lebanon and director of the MasterCard Foundation Scholars Program at AUB. I now invite our guest speakers, Mr. Zisoun, Dr. Sauma Boujawde, Professor Laurie Foster, Dr. Mariam Shamad, and Mr. John Rosenbeek to take their seats on stage.
Working now? Okay. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good break. I was worried before lunch that this panel would be standing between you and lunch, but now I hope you had a good time, a good rest, and we look forward to a great exchange on this panel. I'd like to welcome our speakers, but first, let me introduce the topic a little bit. So behavioral economics is actually emerging as a field with potential to offer opportunities for low-cost, high-impact interventions that can significantly improve education outcomes. On our panel today, we are lucky to have a group of educational experts who will guide us through, and we will start with the context of the region as we argue for nudging as a tool to enhance educational research in the region. Then we will discuss examples of nudges, approaches to teaching behavioral BIs, as well as touch on innovative applications of behavioral theories. I will start by introducing Professor Sauma Boujawde. So Dr. Boujawde is the Associate Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at AUB. He's also a member of the Board of Trustees of Nudge Lebanon. He's currently he holds a PhD and a Master's in Education from the University of Cincinnati. He's the director of the Center of Teaching and Learning and a board member of the International Society for Educational Research. Dr. Boujawde, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Maha. Can you hear me? Are they going to put the presentation?
Yes, it's on. You can see.
Let's fix the technology.
Yeah.
Before we start with the technology, I'm not going to give examples because as of yet we don't have examples of nudges in education in Lebanon that I know of at least. My focus will be on how do we relate research to practice. This is an international problem in educational research in that it does not really relate to practice a lot. My argument is that this, to be able to really relate research to practice in an effective way, requires that we have quality research. At the present time, the current status is that the quality of education research in the Arab world is not up to the level that we'd like it to be. And most of our educational interventions and educational reform uses research that has been done in the West. So we are always borrowing research from the West. My argument is, can we do something about it? I think we can if we really think carefully. And one of the possible solutions is the BI, as Maha was saying. Now, what I'm going to the outline of the presentation, and this is the title, is there a place for nudging in educational settings in the Arab world? Now, a short introduction, then problems with education research in general around the world, and then specifically problems with education research in Arab states. Then how do you identify the problems? Because one of the things that I was thinking about is that educational problems are very complex problems. How do you identify those problems that have the opportunity to improve the quality of education? And then how can research be planned to impact practice? And finally, is nudging applicable in education? Now, there are at least two of the main purposes of research, of education research, is to furnish findings that will help in taking decisions regarding educational issues based on data rather than opinion. Because most of the time it's either we use research from outside, You know, we have a nice idea that we think will be applicable, and then we implement it without really basing it in our context. And then, of course, there is another purpose of researchers is to produce knowledge. However, it has that knowledge that has to be acceptable in publications that are prestigious, because we want to serve the purposes of faculty members in universities, but also satisfy the impact requirements in assisting school improvement. You know, you cannot have one or the other. Now, what are some general problems with education research around the world, actually? And recently I was in a conference whose title was From Research to Practice. And the problem is that lack of relevance to educational policy and practice, lack of scientific rigor, and then, you know, we're looked down as education researchers, we're looked down at by many other fields. What is this for? And then we are ignored by practitioners, by the teachers, and policymakers. And it is criticized for being far removed from what really matters. And one of the interesting criticisms is that it's too progressive to be taken seriously by policymakers. This is, in general, some of the problems with educational research around the world. There are attempts all over the world to remedy the situation. I think the problem of education research in the in Arab states is even worse. Now, research is very limited in scope. You know, the studies that one reads in Arab states are very small studies. You know, they take I do a lot of reviewing of research to be published in journal in Arab states, and they're all very small types of research, maybe appropriate for a master's degree. And there are almost no attempts to conduct large-scale studies that have possible impact on practice. The majority of the studies actually use what we call formulaic quantitative approaches. You know, there is even a template sometimes. If you read the research products, the research articles, it's like you're filling a template. There are certain parts that you fill, and then if you deviate from it, it is not considered good research. It's very focused on inputs and outputs. And we know that processes that go on in the school, in the class inside, are the important factors that influence the type of research. Also, one, I think, very serious problem, very specific to the Arab world, is that, you know, it's limited in country and then does not seem to be related to research that's going on in the world. You know, in the Arab world, only recently there was a database for research in the Arab region, and it is not yet complete. So if I want to know what research has taken place, let's say, in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia or in Oman, I don't know about it. It's really within country. Even within the country, people do not know because we don't have those databases. And then those are the communication infrastructure is not there. We do not communicate as much as we should. I think this is the number 3 is very serious because there is some ban on certain ideas that to be discussed because of the absence of academic freedom. And researchers work in silos, you know, researchers work in their university, sometimes not in the country. You know, in one university, sometimes one researcher does not know what other researchers do. You know, an interesting thing is that, and I use this word which could be controversial, the topics are frequently based on imagined problems that have no practical significance. You find very imagined problems that have no grounding in reality. Also, in terms of rigor, there is no proper rationalization of those studies within a theoretical context or within the literature on education research. And finally, I think one of the things is that most of education researchers in the Arab states do research to be promoted. And when they're promoted, this is done. They stop doing the research. even though the research does not have any impact. You know, an interesting thing here is that we're working on a project now on improving the quality of education research through a project in a database called Shama. And then we found that almost every college of education in the Arab world has its own education journals whose purpose is to publish the research of the faculty members in that college so that they get promoted. Whether it is useful or not. Now, what is needed actually, I think, to find a way to identify the problems, because, you know, the educational problems are very complex. And therefore, we need to find a way to find those problems in their context. Recently, colleagues and I have been working on what is called the cultural historical activity theory, which is a systemic way of trying to identify the problems of schools. And of course, the other possibility is using insights from research in psychology, both of which are based on research to identify the real problems that the schools are facing. Just, you know, I gave an example of how one can identify problems. This is the activity system that we're talking about. You know, you cannot really think of a problem in, let's say, in the instruments or in the subjects or in the object. It's an interaction between those. And the way to find the problem is to find where there are contradictions. According to this theory, the change happens only when you have contradictions. Therefore, if you want to nudge something and implement change in schools, it has to be done within this complex system that we call schools. And a similar diagram could be written for ministries of education, for groups of schools, and so on, so that we identify the complex problems. Now, how can research be planned to impact practice? How can academic research become real-world research, actually? This is the major question, because a lot of research has been published, it's academic, whether it is good quality or not, but it should be relevant, thus based on a real need, in my opinion. It should be rigorous and grounded in theory, and it should be created. Now, how can we plan? One way is to use action research. Nowadays, action research is becoming very important. But if one thinks about action research, it's very similar to what Nudge is doing, but in the context of the school. The other one is the behavioral insights, in my opinion. After looking at some of the studies that have been done, you know, I found that, and this is a definition from the literature, it's an inductive approach to policy making that combines insights from psychology, cognitive science, and social science. And of course, those have to be quality research. We cannot take any research in psychology or any research in cognitive science or any research in social science with empirically tested results to discover how humans actually make choices. Now, if you look at this definition, in my opinion, it responds to many of the weaknesses that I identified regarding the research in the Arab world, in that if you use this methodology, you're relating research to practice, you're testing what you're doing, you're rigorous about how you control for variables and so on. I think the only thing that needs to be added to this is how do you address complex problems, because educational problems are very complex problems. But I tried to match those weaknesses and how many of them could be solved, and I think if we use this approach, it's a very valuable approach. And if we look at nudging, you know, the definition by Thaler and Sunstein, so the nudging policymakers offers policymakers an effective way to influence citizens' behavior without further restricting freedom of choice, which is very important to education. Imposing mandatory obligations, they do not impose them, it still gives them the freedom to decide or introduce new taxations and so on. The idea is that you still have, educators have the freedom, but you give them all the ammunition to be able to take actual decisions. Is nudging applicable in education? My answer is that, like any human behavior in education settings could be the results of cognitive boundaries, biases, or habits, and thus students and teachers and many other stakeholders can be nudged to move into more positive behaviors. You know, we as teachers and policymakers have a lot of biases, what works and what doesn't work. And the decisions are based on those biases of what works and what doesn't work. I think nudges provides the opportunity for those problems to be based on results of research. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Boujodi. Z, you are the Director of Youth Education and Skills at the Behavioral Insights team. Your work covers schools and early years, adult education and skills, consumers and sustainability, as well as productivity and economic growth. You have previously worked at BIT as Principal Advisor, Head of Education and Skills, serving as Director of the Behavioral Research Center for Adult Skills and Knowledge. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Do you mind if I grab the...
Yes.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Again, thank you for that introduction. But thank you also, Dean, for, I guess, that insight into the educational research in the Arab world. Again, much of what you said still resonates with me, even despite coming from a very different regional tradition in education research. Much of the same issues still prevail, I think. But I think but also, I do actually have an education trial I'm going to talk about that's actually happened in Lebanon, but not in the domestic context, but more in the international sort of education context, but happened here in Lebanon, and I'll share with you in just a moment. But I think I just wanted to start my remarks by just mentioning, obviously Richard Thaler's been mentioned several times today, but the one thing that has always stuck with me was a challenge that he sort of put out, that he saw education and the application of behavioral science in education as one of the real vanguards of research in this area, where he thought it had particular potential. And so it's very exciting at BIT to be part of that sweep of empiricism that's hitting educational research, and really quite excited about it as well. And I think one of the things that you mentioned that really strikes a chord also is that there is a degree, surprisingly, but unsurprisingly at the same time, a degree of skepticism that comes from educationalists about sort of new sorts of approaches, and no matter what you say in terms of what we're trying to help support and improve educational outcomes, there's always this sense of, are you really, we know, we're teachers, we know what we're doing and all that. And I think that's one of the hurdles that we've had to constantly overcome in terms of making sure that people know that we're all on the same team in order to improve outcomes. And I think the last thing I wanted to give a slight shout out, in the UK, but then also internationally, is an organisation called the Education Endowment Foundation, which is a What Works centre in the UK that focuses on educational research and what works. But increasingly they're doing work internationally as well. In the UK they've got a thing called the Teaching and Learning Toolkit that tries to gather all the evidence about different types of interventions and how much they cost, the effect size you're expecting on different types of metrics, and the evidence base around it, and so how confident you should be that this thing actually works in the way that that you hope it will. And increasingly they're looking for international opportunities to I guess, find research partners in order to ground what they've done in the UK internationally, so they can have essentially a teaching and learning toolkit for countries all around the world as well. So a particular shout out to that. But without going more on the general stuff, I thought I would actually dive into a couple of trial results and really give you a couple of examples of some trials that actually had an impact on educational outcomes. I've chose two in many ways very similar trials, but also very different trials. They're similar in the respect that they're both text message trials and they involve sending text messages, but they also demonstrate quite clearly how text messages are a medium, but not necessarily a specific technique in and of themselves, because they use them in very different sorts of ways in order to shift educational outcomes. And they're also done in two very different contexts. One is done in the UK, and the other one is done in refugee camps here in Lebanon and in Jordan as well. So the first trial that I wanted to talk to you about is a trial that we ran in further education colleges in the UK. Further education colleges are, I'm trying to think what the equivalent is perhaps here, but the avenue where perhaps you would go to instead of university, but is more technical education focused. More often than not, though, in the UK, a lot of the students who go through the further education system are those that previously haven't done quite so well in education in the past. So either immediately they haven't done so well and they're going down this route of education, or historically you've got older learners coming through who want to improve and upskill themselves through this further education process. And this trial focused specifically on learners who are studying maths and English. Again, there was changes in policy in the UK that basically students at a young age all had to get a certain qualification in maths and English, but again, in terms of engaging in life and society, these are quite fundamental skills. And so we ran a suite of trials on this particular target group, but one of the interventions we tried is sort of this study supporter intervention, which I think is probably one of my favorite interventions BRT has ever run, because it starts to mobilize a body of research around learning, that essentially, and a body of research, but then also a fundamental understanding that we all experience in our lives, that when we learn, we don't learn in isolation. That we learn while the pursuits are, we're going to have to sit our test ourselves, or we're going to eventually have to do certain assessments by ourselves. Learning happens with the support of those around us. And the key question is, well, can you mobilize that support in the most effective and efficient way possible in order to support that learner? And can this actually have an outcome on whether they engage with learning and subsequently attain more significantly than they would otherwise? So we ran this trial in collaboration with our dear friend Todd Rogers at the Harvard Kennedy School, and it was really about, well, can we then put in the hands of these study supporters key information that can help them support these people in their life. So at the beginning of semester, at the beginning of term, we got learners to identify study supporters in their life, and so it could either be a parent, a friend, an acquaintance, and we got them to essentially identify them so that we could send them text messages on the learner's behalf. So a couple of examples of the text messages. These ones. So first one is, hi Kate, Raj is learning about converting between metrics and imperial units. Please ask him how many kilometers in a mile. Thanks, Aylesbury College. And so again, it didn't come from us. We wanted to really make it feel like it came from the college environment itself. So again, equipping the study supporter with something to actually engage the learner with. Yeah? And so we got all sorts of responders. This is a bit of an example. So how is college going, Raj? And this text message from the study supporter to the learner. How is college going? I hear you've been learning about kilometers and miles. How many kilometers in 1 mile? And there was all these sorts of messages that were coming through. And I think also what was quite encouraging is we could see messages back to us when we sent them. That was like, thank you very much. I really want Raj to succeed. I'll do whatever I can. It was really encouraging to see that. But again, text messages, not that cost intensive, but it did require a bit of thought in order to make sure the messages were relevant to the learner at the particular time of their course. Would this kind of text message have an effect on, say, attendance? Let's have a look. So we looked at attendance at a couple of points during it. One is mid-year, and the other is full year. So as you can see from the results there, the blue one is the group of students who received the study supporter. So the control group, just so you know, is people who said that they wanted to be part of the trial and nominated study supporters, but we did not send their study supporters text messages because we knew there would be some sort of sampling effect if you compared it to people who did not nominate supporters. So it's comparing groups that people who wanted to nominate study supporters. So you can see it has impact on mid-year attendance rates, but it also has an effect on full-year attendance rates. Great, they're more likely to show up to class. That's good. But the big question for us is, well, that's important, but does that actually change their attainment? Does it change the educational outcomes that are most important to us? Well, let's have a look. So again, one of the things you might be slightly astounded by is the baseline attainment rate. So these are students who, again, as I mentioned before, haven't necessarily succeeded in education in the past. So the attainment for the whole group is always going to be quite low. But you see for the control group, it's 22.2%. And for those who received the study supported intervention, were 28.1. So almost a 6 percentage point bump in the number of students passing all their maths and English exams. Again, this intervention suddenly didn't equip them with we didn't boost their IQ, didn't suddenly equip them with like specialized knowledge on a particular subject that allowed them to succeed in that test. But what it did do was mobilize the social networks to help motivate the learner, really encourage them throughout what is often a difficult learning experience. And so for us, we were really quite pleased with the result, given the cohort of learners coming through and obviously the substance of the result as well. But again, as we've noted several times throughout this conference, this is a result from the UK. How applicable is these sorts of interventions in the broader context, say in Lebanon, or perhaps in the most difficult educational settings you could potentially imagine? So, BIT has been doing more and more work looking at the outcomes, educational outcomes of children in refugee camps, particularly early childhood education. For those of you who are aware of the literature, these are some of the most important years of education in an individual's life, and they're transformative. And the thing that we were always concerned about, particularly, and not just us, but everybody's involved in the space, is that by being located or being displaced, they're missing out on some of the most important years of education, and that they will be I guess, feeling the consequences of that for their whole life. And so we started to embark on a trial with the International Rescue Committee, the big international charity, and as well as Vroom, a sort of technology education company as well, looking at, well, can we start to equip parents in refugee camps with access to important early education material in order to help them support their children while they're in refugee camps with their learning outcomes. So, can behavioural insights be used in this sort of context, in perhaps the most difficult learning context imaginable? So, again, it's just a bit of an image to bring it to life. A learning centre at one of the refugee camps where I mentioned as a text message trial, where a lot of the phone numbers were collected from parents in order to be part of the trial itself. I thought this is also a bit of a nifty picture. It's actually at the refugee camp itself, which shows you see that a little antenna that's popping up. That's a Wi-Fi connection, so that they can actually access Wi-Fi at the camp itself. You also notice there's a bit of a water bottle on top to protect it from water and whatnot, and like shows you how important access to internet is. And the last one is a particular individual who was part of the trial, who I think was really explaining to us when we were doing some of the research how frustrating it is to be in a refugee camp and not having anything to do. And so part of it was, well, if we can equip them with something they can do to not only entertain themselves, but also to support children in the community and children of their own, can we not do something like this? So we decided to run a trial where we text message parents, a randomised control trial involving some 12,000 families in the camps in Jordan and Lebanon. We send them 2 different types of text messages. So there are 7 text messages sent over a 2-week period. One type of text message is focused on like the scientific importance, really focused on the science element of supporting your child in early education and in terms of like brain development. I'll show you an example of one of the text messages in a second. The second stream of text messages around, I think the more parent-orientated thing is like, you're a parent, this is something that you should do. But I'll give you a tangible example in a second so you can have a look. And the idea was then what we were going to measure was a couple of things. There was a link in there to a YouTube clip of a video of which they could get they could show to their child and learn with their child. And so we measured click-through rates from the text message as well as the actual views on YouTube of this video. What sort of results we expect? So here are the examples of text message. So the parent one was, and again, this was the one we actually thought was going to be more successful. So the parent type message says, you can have fun and play games with your child while doing everyday things. You can play even while getting dressed. Click here to watch. Again. And the contrast is the science one. You could, your child is constantly learning from what's around you, which helps him grow smarter. They can learn while even getting dressed. Click here. Again, showing a slightly different emphasis. So the first one emphasizing of the play elements of that interaction. And I'm just trying to, there we go. The play and the science ones on the learning aspect and that growing smarter aspect, some of the growth mindset stuff you might have heard of previously. Well, what are the results? Let's have a quick look. It actually looks like the science one had the bigger effect in terms of both views and click-throughs on the effect of parents really engaging in that early childhood context. And again, the reason why I wanted to show you this trial result was for us, it was a bit of a first in running a randomised control trial in a refugee camp. And being able to mobilise this sort of empirical approach in research and education in this kind of context. But then also really testing out, well, often the challenge is made, well, you can do this in the UK, you can do this in the developing world, can we do this in more difficult circumstances? And what we hope to do is use this as a leverage point for further research in these different learning settings. I guess just to conclude then, we continue to do more and more stuff in the education space at VIT, and we've actually got a couple of publications that I just sort of flagged with you. One specifically on behavioural insights in education, which looks at it from a couple of perspectives. So one is BI in education for parents. So if you're a parent, well, how does behavioural insights apply to supporting your child in the educational experience? Really trying to ground that in that space. Another one, so if you're a teacher, what does the literature tell you about what you can do using behavioural science to support your learning in the classroom further? And the last one is for school leaders. So if you're a school administrator or a principal, are there things that you can do to help support the running of your educational institution in terms of getting teachers on board, motivating teachers in order to succeed? Because I guess we kind of realise that each of the different stakeholders in education will probably have a slightly different role, but behavioural insights can look to support all of them in those different types of approaches.
Thank you.
I'll show you the data.
Yeah, it's too small for us.
Send you some of the report.
Thank you, Z. Laurie, Professor Laurie Foster is the Professor of Industrial Organization Psychology at North Carolina State University. She served as Behavioral Sciences Advisor to the UN, and her areas of research and practice expertise include workforce development, computer-mediated work behavior, and organizational survey design and analysis. Laurie, please go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. So I really liked the previous two presentations, and I wanted to draw on a little bit of what's been said already and expand on it a bit. So one of the things I'll mention, I showed earlier in the day the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and you probably saw education prominently displayed there. There's a lot of discussion around education, both in the context of children, of course, but also in the context of adults and lifelong learning. As technology continues to progress and automation changes the nature of work, it's projected that we're going to have to continue to learn how to get education and training in order to stay relevant throughout the course of our lives. So I think this discussion around nudges in education is important, not only for children, but for adults too. Here I'd like to expand on the model that Josh Martin from Ideas 42 showed you earlier today, where the kind of typical model for going through a BI project is to start by spending a lot of time, as Josh mentioned, on the problem definition, then moving to the diagnosis of the behavioral barriers or bottlenecks, why people aren't exhibiting the behaviors you think they ought, designing an intervention, and then finally testing that. And what I want to do here is make even more explicit something that you heard in the previous presentation. When it comes to that diagnostic phase, and you're trying to nudge the behavior of population A, I think it's tempting to often think about, okay, then how do I nudge population A if I'm trying to change population A's behavior? But there's really some pretty cool examples, and you just heard a few of them, where if you're trying to change the behavior of population A, there are opportunities to nudge population B, who has an influence over population A, right? So in the context of students, who, in addition to nudging the students, who around that student in the support network might be influential and might be a candidate for intervention when you're thinking about that third bubble and what your intervention might be. I picked out a couple of examples for you today, and they have both been tested in various parts of the world, and so they give me a little bit more confidence. But the two broad points are this question around who do you nudge, is it population A or a support? And the second key question is when do you nudge in this educational context? So I will start with a study from many years ago that some of you will be familiar with, and it'll be new to others, by Rosenthal and Jacobson. So they did this study where they went into the classroom, and you can imagine this as it unfolded. Went into the classroom and they gave the children in the classroom an examination, a test. They took the tests upon completion, and then they came back to the teachers later and said, with a list of a subset of the students, and they said, these students on this list, they're really going to blossom. They're really going to progress this year. So just be on the lookout for their advanced development this year. At the end of the year, the researchers came back into the classroom and they administered the exam once again. And sure enough, the students on the list, on average, performed better, exhibited greater gains than the students who weren't on the list. Now, if I told you nothing else about this study, what I would conclude is that must have been an awesome test that they administered at the beginning of the year, right? That it was really able to identify who was going to go and exhibit great gains. But the reality, those of you who know the work of Rosenthal and Jacobson know, the reality is that the children on that list were chosen at random, right? And so the question was, what's going on in this context? And of course, the question was, will this even replicate? And for whom will it replicate? I mentioned adult learners a few minutes ago. Children, one might argue, are impressionable, but could something like that actually work with adults? And the answer is it has been replicated. in a lot of different contexts in many different parts of the world, and not only with children, but with adults, trainees in the workplace as well, in industrial settings and in other settings where an elevated expectation, even if randomly assigned, leads to elevated performance. This is even replicated amongst groups of workers. There was one study in particular that was looking at military forces where entire platoons were randomly assigned to be dubbed high aptitude versus unknown aptitude, and the higher aptitude platoons outperformed at the end of the training those who were in the control group. There was a meta-analysis that was conducted in 2000, I believe, that was looking at this at large and saw that the effects do tend to be replicable. Funny word, Pygmalion. Does that look familiar at all? A little bit, yes. What's it?
This is My Fair Lady.
My Fair Lady, yes, exactly. So there's a movie, My Fair Lady, which was based on a novel by George Bernard Shaw called Pygmalion, which was probably based on the Greek mythology, the Pygmalion, the sculptor in Greek mythology. And the story, as I understand it, goes that Pygmalion as a sculptor was very talented in what he did, but he hated women, and he vowed that he would never fall in love, that he'd have nothing to do with women. Yet he sculpted this statue, whom he called Galatea, and the statue was so beautiful that he decided this was the perfect woman. And he had this expectation around this statue that was so strong and so vivid that ultimately the statue, Galatea, comes to life. His expectation becomes the reality. So this effect that I've described has sometimes been called the Pygmalion effect, where the expectation becomes the reality. And it's cyclical, so it begins on the top with the instructor's expectation. And when that instructor's expectation is elevated, knowingly or unknowingly, or perhaps both, the instructor exhibits greater leadership and attention towards the pupil, towards the student. This could come verbally, non-verbally, smiling, eye contact, more challenging assignments, calling on the student more often, et cetera, et cetera. When that leadership and attention is devoted to a student, that says something to him or her, that I'm worth it and that I can do this. And it elevates the student's own expectation, which of course is motivating, when you believe in yourself. That motivation leads to increased performance, which in turn reinforces both the instructor and the student's high expectations, and the cycle in a very virtuous and positive way persists. So that's how the theory goes, and you can see in that some opportunities for nudges, both with respect to the elevated expectations, but also with respect to breaking down that leadership and attention bubble, figuring out exactly what that looks like, and then teaching trainers to teach at large in that manner. Final example, how early should we be nudging? Boy, this is pretty early, huh? But here's some research that's been done in more than one location, actually, and I think you'll find it interesting, where they're testing something called a universal college savings account at birth. Effectively, infants, this particular study was in Oklahoma, but it's occurred in other parts of the world as well, where randomly selecting infants at birth to receive a college savings account, and then tracking to see what effects that might have on the child's development. Now you can imagine that a baby in diapers isn't kind of saying, ha ha ha, I've got a savings account and you don't. But something does seem to be happening, right? For instance, in this study, quote, at the time of the follow-up survey, about 3 years after the Seed Oklahoma experiment began, disadvantaged treatment children scored better than disadvantaged control children on a measure of social emotional development. So you can see that even at that early phase, kind of nudging the support network, in this case, in the context of a college savings account, can have positive effects. So those are my two main messages for this particular panel. When doing that diagnostic phase, thinking about who can be nudged and thinking about how early we might start that. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Mariam, you are the Executive Advisor at the French Behavioral Insights Unit at Direction Interministérielle de la Transformation Publique. Your work consists in translating findings and methods from cognitive and behavioral sciences into improvements in public policies and programs. You're also highly involved in de-biasing programs, which you have developed to help improve critical thinking and mental flexibility. We look forward to it.
Thank you very much. So we've talked a lot about applying nudges to education and also about nudging in general. But what if, and nudging is done on the basic assumption that we have certain shortcomings maybe in our decision making or in our judgments. So what if now we shift the discussion to what about teaching about these biases and about these shortcomings to people, so improving critical thinking skills. And so I'll be talking about the different things we've done in terms of teaching behavioral insights to public agents, to students, and to citizens, and with different approaches. And before I go into this, I'd like to share with you the first thing that I studied in my cognitive neuroscience studies was optical illusions. And maybe some of you know this illusion, but for those who don't, so if you look at this checkerboard, you can see that there's a square where there's written A and another one where it's written B. I hope everyone sees it in the back. And so I assume that for everyone here, or at least hopefully for everyone, the square A looks darker than the square B, right? Is there anyone who sees them as the same? Yes? Wow, my mom is the most unbiased person in this room. Given that this is why I get the biased genes. So basically, the idea is that these two squares are exactly the same shade. So A and B are both exactly the same, even though our brain is cabled in a way that we cannot see them the same. And trust me, they are. When I presented this to one of the ministers in France, he asked us to cut out the paper so that he can check it. So if you want, we can do that later on. And what's interesting here is that your brain is doing a couple of different operations. So first of all, the square B is in the shade of this green thing there. And your brain knows that things that are in the shade in general look darker than they appear. So your brain's already correcting for this information of the shade. And second of all, here we're in a checkerboard, so there's alternating colors of light gray and dark gray. And so your brain is again predicting what's going on here. And so a lot of the work that I did when I studied optical illusions were what are these operations that the brain is doing to predict what's seeing. So the brain isn't a tool that's projecting reality exactly the way it is, but rather doing a lot of probabilistic operations and inferences to give us the final product. And so since then, I was very much convinced that if we understood these mechanisms, if we understood that our brain is sometimes rearranging reality in a way to make the world more easy to navigate, because after optical illusions, I also worked on how our brain tells us stories to make us sound heroes of our own lives, etc. So I was very convinced by this idea that if people understood these limitations, these cognitive limitations that we have, and had better metacognition on how their brain functions, then maybe it could be one source of having more doubting more your behavior and having a better understanding of your own biases. So this is where this whole wanting to teach about behavioral insights and cognitive limitations came from. And so we've been doing this on several levels. So on one level, we've been teaching BIs both the basics of behavioral cognitive biases, but also nudges to public agents. So we've tried this with different types of public agents. For instance, we did introduction to BIs and biases and nudges with very immersive workshops where the agents had to go on the field and first of all have their own assumptions on what behavior would occur, but then go confront these assumptions to reality and see whether there were biases in their judgments. We did 2 months of immersion, for instance, with them. This was specifically on the topic of why people don't necessarily have eco-friendly behavior in public schools. And it was a very interesting experience with these public agents on biases. I'm just going to skip this to go a bit faster. We've also tried to teach BIs and behavioral insights to students in different ways. So either in short formats, so we've done like nudge challenges, where students had to simply deliver a video of a nudge that they implemented, but also taken from the nudgeathon format that we've tried to also apply. And we've also had full semester practical workshops on behavioral insights. And in the coming semester, we're going to be giving a course in France with internships within government on specific BIs. So what I want to get to mainly is this, because this is what I think is a new thing we're trying to implement right now. So it's teaching critical thinking and metacognition in general. And so I've co-founded with other colleagues of mine a think tank called Chiasma. You can check out our website if you're interested. And the main aim of Chiasma is basically to teach critical thinking and belief update and mental flexibility. So what we're trying to do in this think tank is basically to train people to have healthier debates. And to have healthier debates, it means that you have to understand how arguments, how an opinion is formed, how your arguments align to create a certain opinion. And so we do a lot of logical fallacy and cognitive bias training in very applied workshops. So the way this happens is, so we've tried very different formats, but the recent format we've been sticking to is basically organizing debates on various topics. So for instance, the last one we organized was are long-term solutions compatible with short-term mandates. So the topics can be very different. It can be, for example, globalization, dilute culture. The topic is just a means for us, and what we do in these debates is that the audience or the people that we're trying to teach basically have to detect logical fallacies and biases in the argumentation. So first of all, this gives them a training to understand how arguments are formed, but also it gives them a tool to understand when their own argumentation and reasoning can have shortcomings. And logical fallacies and biases are very connected. A lot of biases that we have can come also from the way our reasoning works. So for example, when we have like binary thinking, binary thinking is something that I see a lot in the discussion about nudging, for example, where people, when you talk about nudges, think that nudging is going to come replace everything else while it's complementary. So we have these natural tendencies of thinking in ways that are sometimes not necessarily extremely efficient or optimal. So we try to study the links between logical fallacies and biases, but also recently we've been concentrating a lot on studying the efficiency of unconscious bias training, because there's a lot of discussion about this, whether you can teach people to detect fallacies and biases, but is it domain specific? Are they going to only apply to what you've taught them and not apply to the rest of the domains of their activities? And so now there's a student actually who's going to be studying the specific like transferability of teaching about unconscious bias and understanding whether it actually changes behavior or not. So part of the things we've been doing with Chiasma, and now we're trying to bring it inside government, is first of all helping people deconstruct biases and fallacies in political debates. So for instance, if you're interested, if you check out Chiasma on Medium, we have a page where, for example, the Trump and Hillary debates or other political debates, we deconstructed the fallacies in the argumentation or the biases that were at play. We also, so the guide that you see here on the left is a guide that we did for the French elections. So during the French elections, we did like a surviving the elections guide, where different types of arguments were presented, and we were explaining, we're deconstructing these arguments and saying what are the fallacies or biases behind them. We're also right now working on a pamphlet for biases in supermarkets. So basically, how do you detect the fallacies in ads or biases that are inside the supermarket to get your attention to a certain product compared to another? And we're also developing a course which is very much inspired by a course given in Washington University. I don't know if you know it. It's called Calling Bullshit. It's an extremely interesting course, and everything's online. So we're trying to give it in French in a university. So this is interesting because it's basically calling bullshit on yourselves. So understanding when your own reasoning or your own behavior has shortcomings, but also calling bullshit in data. So for example, when you get data, how do you know if it's reliable? What is the sample size? Things like that. Also calling bullshit on experts. So for example, when an expert comes to deliver you information, how do you evaluate the expertise of the person? How do you know if it's valuable or not? And the next step will be calling bullshit in public policies. So for example, knowing whether a policy, when it's laid out, what is the reason why this policy was laid out? Was it based on evidence? And what were the impacts of it? So I don't know if I'm going overboard, but I'd like to end the discussion on nudge versus boost, because for us, I don't know if you've heard of boost. Can you just raise your hands if you've heard of boost approaches, just to know if I can? Okay, perfect. So, in Germany, there's this whole research led by Gerd Gigerenzer, who has a slightly different approach than Daniel Kahneman's approach, by saying that we should stop saying that people are irrational and that our irrationality is perhaps adaptive. I won't go into the details of this, but the approaches that are developed there are a bit different than the nudge approach. There are a lot of similarities, but they put a lot of accent on educating people. So how to make people sufficiently informed so that they can make informed decisions on their own. So there's a much bigger autonomy left for the person to actually decide what they want to do. And so they work a lot on, for example, on risk literacy. How do you teach people to understand about risk? How do you teach people to understand about their own shortcomings so that they can overcome them? So how do you get people boost their own rationality somehow? And so to do the link between what I just said previously, I feel like putting the accent on critical thinking and helping people understand their own shortcomings is a promising way to do things, because even though nudge, of course, is extremely interesting in some cases and very interesting in the cases where people don't have enough resources, cognitive resources or attention to integrate all the information, that's where nudge is interesting. But boost is also very interesting because sometimes nudges can seem like clutches, and when you remove the clutches, the person maybe falls, while critical thinking and boost approaches will perhaps help people make more long-term rational decisions for the good reasons, because they understood the reason why they're behaving this way, and it's not that the case that when the nudge fades or when you remove the nudge, then the behavior disappears. Thank you.
John, you are a doctoral researcher at the University of Cambridge. Your dissertation is on evolving media narratives in the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics in eastern Ukraine. You also do research on fake news and disinformation, primarily from the perspective of social psychology and inoculation theory, which will be the focus of your intervention today.
Yeah. This is working, right? Yeah, great. So I'm not, as you may know, a behavioral scientist or even a social psychologist. What I do is I study media. So I might be coming at this from a slightly different perspective. But about 2 years ago, I guess I got interested in fake news or disinformation, however you might want to call it, for various reasons. And then sort of over the years, I've tried to come up with different ways to mitigate that problem, I guess. So first I kind of want to discuss why is this even a problem? Why are we talking about this? So the term fake news, of course, is something that you've all heard, I'm sure, many times, but it's not exactly a great term, because if we look at this, please, yeah. This is fake news, right? Of course, this is not true. Kim Jong-un was, tragically, I guess, not named the Onion's sexiest man alive for 2012, or at least he was, but the Onion is not a real outlet. But this is completely fake. The funny part about this was, of course, that it was picked up by an actual serious newspaper in China, I think the People's Daily, that took this seriously and ran with it for a couple of stories, much to the Onion's delight, of course. But even though this is completely fake, it's not exactly harmful. I think we can all agree this is a prank, this is a joke, right? But this is a much bigger problem. So this is, a news world, of course, is not anything you should take very seriously. But what it says here is that it takes a video of people running into a church, basically, and the caption that's written alongside it says, Muslim immigrants are attacking a Catholic church during Mass. That's not true. It's not clear if these people are Muslim. It's not clear if these people are immigrants. And they are certainly not attacking the church. They are simply protesting there peacefully against new immigration laws that are about to be passed in France. So, but this is not fake, as in this video actually exists, right? This story is not completely made up. It's just that the way the information is presented, that is unreliable, or as we would say, wrong. So conceptually, that makes the problem quite hard to study, and that also makes it quite difficult to say, okay, well, how do you make sure that people become less susceptible to fake news or disinformation, or however you might want to call it? So enter inoculation theory. I won't have time to explain this full graph here. Please ask me after the presentation, I guess, if you want to learn more. But inoculation theory basically it's kind of like a preemptive nudge. So it tries to get in there before people have acquired fixed set beliefs. And it tries to sort of forewarn, I guess, people against the possibility of deceit. So this graph is about climate change, basically, and the bar that's most important here is the yellow one, where people were basically said in advance, okay, well, there might be people out to deceive you when it comes to simple facts about climate change. And when they were then asked, okay, well, so what is your, what do you think about climate change, they would be closer to the scientific norm than they would be in either the control group or when they had been presented with fake news, which is the red bar. So that kind of idea of a vaccine against disinformation seems to work within the context of climate change. So what we tried to do is generalize that to see if we could develop, let's say, a general all-purpose vaccine against disinformation. And the way we chose to do that was by focusing not on specific instances of deceit, but on the techniques that are used in its creation. So we made this game in which players learn these techniques in the form of badges. So we try to distill these techniques down to 6 fairly intuitive, simple to grasp concepts like impersonation, conspiracy theories, and so on. And in so doing, basically place the player in the position of the bad guy. So in the game, you're the villain, and you're tasked with creating or building a website that produces fake news. And the game rewards you effectively your bad behavior. So that looks like this. It's sort of like a browser version of it. So it's choice-based. As you can see, the trick here is that this is not really Donald Trump's Twitter handle. It says Donald J. Trump instead of Trump. But if you just read it very cursively and you don't pay close attention, you might be misled into thinking, oh wait, that's actually Donald Trump declaring war on North Korea. Not the case. So you essentially get rewarded for promoting that kind of behavior and other kinds of behavior. And you get more followers, as you can see in the top left corner, and more credibility in the bottom left corner by, behaving in an unethical way when it comes to journalism. And the idea behind this was, well, if you know the magic trick, right, if someone explains to you how the magic trick works, the next time around when you're confronted with it, it's no longer magic, it's just another trick. So we ran a survey to see if people would actually be susceptible to this kind of thing, if that would actually work. That looks like this. So what we did was we asked people to rate the reliability of certain tweets, and some of these tweets would make use of certain techniques that you learn in the game. So the first, the bars come in pairs. The first 4 bars, I guess, are control questions. So we were hoping to see that there would be no change whatsoever in those 2 before and after playing. So the bar on the left is before, and the bar on the right is after playing. And then the last 3 pairs of bars are the actual technique questions. So you see that there's a pretty substantial sort of lower reliability rating the second time people are basically after playing. So that's fairly positive, and the sample size here, so we got very lucky with the press coverage, I guess, is 8,000, so that's very nice. It makes for very nice statistics and so on. So we're quite happy with that. Which means we're, continuing. If the button will let me. Here we are. So of course, like these surveys, right, they don't show you any kind of definitive results because you need much more testing than that. So that's what we're doing right now with this. And we are translating the game together with Fadi and his team to Arabic, which will be done in hopefully the next month or 2, something like that. And then it will be implemented here as well, and Fadi and his team will be designing studies with it, which is very exciting. And Russian, we just found a Russian translator from Kiev to also see how this works in another cultural context, namely Ukraine and Russia. And one idea we've had so far also together with Fadi is that we want to see if this kind of idea might be applied to radicalization, for example. So similar to disinformation, which you can distill into several techniques, you could also say, well, what about recruitment efforts into radical groups? You might also think, okay, well, that exists of certain components that you could call techniques as well. And how do you then write scenarios that show people how these techniques work? And what we've seen and what we're hoping to continue to see is that the game we made will be used in education as well, hence, of course, my participation in this panel. So what we did after the game launched, which was in February, was we wrote this cheat sheet for people who want to use it in class, which you can download on the website, which sort of explains the whole background behind it and makes it much easier for anyone to use it in any way they see fit. I hope that was 6 minutes. I think I'm done.
Yes, thank you so much. So this has been one of my favorite panels so far. Thank you so much for the great interventions. I look forward to the audience's questions. I think we've spoken about nudges and behavioral insights at the level of the learner as well as the level of the whole environment around learning. We've touched upon the research perspectives in the region and elsewhere, and we've seen a very interesting example from John about the inoculation theory and fighting fake news. So we'll take a few questions from the audience and then we'll... Okay, please go ahead.
I have a question. Can I start?
Yeah, please start. Go ahead.
I have a question on the disinformation game. Several years ago, ICIJ, the International Consortium for Investigative Journalism, they had an online game about how to stash your cash. They're trying to show people how easy you can launder money. After some years of putting this game online, some people started to misuse it. Some lawyers started to really look for some tricks and tips coming from this game. So after that, ICIJ just shut it down. Do you think this kind of games might be like a nudge for misbehaving sometimes? Thank you.
We have a question here. Please go ahead.
Hello? Yeah. I work here at the business school, and we're just embarking on a new form of education called blended learning, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts regarding whether there's any behavioral insights that we should be aware of as we move towards blended learning and therefore distance learning. Thank you.
One more question.
Good morning. So a lot of this nudge thinking, similar to what you were saying before, good teachers already do this, and so they have this resistance towards new research. And a lot of them do it without really being conscious of the science behind it. But then there's this risk if you come along and then, okay, try to teach teachers, like, okay, the ones who are already doing it, better for them. The ones who are not, do the opposite, and they kind of spell it out to, you know, and then you lose the nudge effect, you know? So I don't know how do you propose to do this, and then you have to be subtle about it. I don't know. I hope you understood my question, because...
So, Nabil, go ahead.
Saleh from Nudge Lebanon, and my question is for Mr. Zisoun. It's a bit technical. I just wanted to know about the IRB process that BIT follows when you're working with people like refugees and vulnerable people in general. Thank you.
So, we start with the answers.
I think all three of those questions. So maybe not the first one. On your point around blended learning, it's definitely an area that we're interested in, and we're starting to do more and more work in this space. So we've just actually been commissioned to do a project with the Workers' Education Association in the UK, and they provide blended sort of learning options, and we're looking at really testing different types of interventions, because it's tough, right? Blended learning is difficult, it's new, and then how you best integrate it. One of the interesting things we found, we've actually recently finished a trial looking at supporting learners who are trying to study computer science. And part of the model is they learn how to code online, as you would expect. And then we tried to introduce interventions as part of their learning on this online module. And so there's some literature around, for example, mindsets. This is Carol Dweck's work around fixed and growth mindset. We actually tried to introduce some interventions at different points throughout their learning program online. Actually, it didn't work. Actually, it had a negative impact on the number of attempts students were learning. And so, again, it was quite a surprising result for us. And similarly, we tried different things on our anchoring. And so I think the short answer is I don't have all the answers for you, but it is an interesting area, because learning in the digital space is quite an intriguing area, and that we've got to approach that quite differently perhaps from what we do in the classroom. So I guess short answer is hopefully we should have some more answers for you in the future, but it is an interesting space, and online and in-person should be thought of not completely distinctively, but should be thought of, I think, in ways that are definitely different.
Thank you.
Do you want me to, your specific question about the IRB aspects? Yeah, for us, whenever there's an intervention on particularly vulnerable groups, we take it really quite seriously. And so depending on the trial itself, whether it's we partner with an individual academic or academic institution, we usually go through their IRBs as part of the evaluation of whether this is something we should proceed with. Similarly, even within BIT, we have an academic advisory panel who we seek advice from around difficult interventions where there is no university partner. And also, even within the UK government, there is like a trials advisory board who's willing to sort of help provide and support services in and around those IRB processes. But you're absolutely right. Particularly when you're dealing with vulnerable individuals, you want to think very carefully about how you, and ethics around introducing interventions around that space.
Thank you. Dr. Jawdi.
In response to blended learning, I think this is a very good example of how we borrow ideas without really collecting evidence about them. I think universities should be all about evidence, and when you're implementing something, you need to collect evidence whether or not this is really a fad that we're importing, or whether it is a useful way for the learning of students. I think it's a very good example of how we get ideas without really trying to collect evidence about their effectiveness or not. If I understand the question of your question, I think if it is based on need, and if it comes from the field itself, then the possibility of teachers trying to implement it increases a lot. But it is when it's the fact, if it is imagined or it is top-down, that's when you're not sure whether they're going to implement the innovations or the results of research or not.
Lori, would you like to add anything?
With respect to blended learning, I do think it's a very interesting question and opportunity, an area in which to apply behavioral insights. One key starting point would be on that definition bubble. If you remember the define and diagnose, design, and test, and kind of thinking about within that environment, what are the exact challenges that we want to tackle. It could include things around cheating, for instance, when there's not a proctor watching over the behavior. It could be around feelings of isolation. It could be around feelings of motivation. I suppose one thing I would mention is, figuring out what's special about that environment that we can capitalize on rather than trying to replicate the physical classroom environment, including the opportunity for experimentation, right, in that digital world, trying different things. And in that online world, you're often able to actually measure behaviors and results in a way that you may not be able to in a physical classroom setting as readily. So there could be some interesting opportunities to learn about behavioral insights in that context as well. And then finally, with respect to the good teachers kind of doing this and how to break down that resistance to change, I'm reminded of again, Kurt Lewin, in this case, his notion that behavior is a function of the person and the environment. And I would look at, in that environment, What is the institutional, the organizational context around those teachers? Is it one in which they're expected to change and feeling like they're not doing a good job and feeling like they have so many other things to do that it's difficult to learn this new behavior? Or is it an environment that encourages them to grow, in their skill set? And of course, there are going to be still individual differences and reactions to that mandate to improve one's teaching through nudges. But I think the institutional organizational context can go a long way in facilitating or thwarting efforts to nudge teachers in the manners we've discussed.
Thank you, Lori. John, would you like to answer the question of the gentleman in the back?
It's a good question. We thought about that quite a bit before launching the game because we thought, we can't actually train an army of fake news creators. That's not a very good idea. That kind of exacerbates the problem rather than solves it. But the thing is that the techniques that you learn in the game are not really a secret, not in any way really. So if you were inclined to start a website, say, and start spreading or creating fake news, you would easily be able to do so even without the game. And second, I guess, is you need some kind of ulterior motivation as well that goes beyond, oh, hey, this would be fun. Because it takes a lot of time, investment, takes some money. You have to be actually quite good at it before it pays off. And a lot of this also has a political dimension when it veers into the territory of propaganda. And the game that we designed anyway doesn't really encourage you financially or politically to approach this kind of thing from that angle or those angles. So in that sense, we think that the benefits of this kind of intervention sort of outweigh the potential downsides of it. We haven't heard of anyone starting a fake news site after playing the game. If we do, I'll happily come back to apologize, because that doesn't sound like a good idea.
Thank you. Mariam, I have a question to you. When you presented to us the work you're doing under Kiasma on building the thinking skills and critical thinking in particular, have you done any evaluations of these interventions in order to determine how efficient they were in reaching the objective?
Yeah. So this is one of the points that I mentioned, is that right now we're actually getting a PhD student to actually work on evaluating the effectiveness of these workshops, because so far we haven't really done that. We haven't really evaluated. We've been doing this for almost 2 years in very different contexts. We've tried it just in public spaces, in museums. We even did it with public agents. And in actual workshops in different companies, but we haven't evaluated the effectiveness on reduction of bias, and this is exactly what we're starting to do now. And actually, one thing we're doing, because the events we do are free, is that now the paying fee for the event is going to be in the experiment. So people will have to do a small experiment, and then they can attend the event. So this is the way we're planning to collect the data. But yeah, it's the plan for now.
Thank you so much. So I'll give a last word for each one of the panelists, and then we will conclude. Any questions?
One more.
Oh, sorry. Okay, go ahead. I think we have like a few minutes.
Arab governments currently are pushing the notion of entrepreneurship education and entrepreneurship programs by virtue of the unemployment rates being as high as they are. So it's a policy prescription, in essence. So entrepreneurship, the way it's implemented in the region currently, is really a hybrid of education and work, because a lot of the startups are functioning or operational during the workshops that students and entrepreneurs are attending. So really this hybrid model of work and education in one program, what kind of nudge prescriptions would you have?
Anyone would like?
For entrepreneurship programs.
Please.
And I'll use this as my last word too, because I can see. So thank you for the question, and I would refer you to an article, and if you can't find it, let me know. It was published in Science within the past year. It is a very good article by a scholar by the name of Michael Frese, F-R-E-S-E, who did a very nice randomized control trial, a field experiment. It was longitudinal, and it was comparing traditional entrepreneurship training to psychologically informed entrepreneurship training. And by that I mean it was teaching and testing elements of proactivity and other things that aren't included in the typical training around developing a business model and whatnot. And it was a very clean evaluation showing really the value of taking some of these mindsets and some of these psychological factors into account, and the fact that they are malleable and can be taught. So I think that might be a good starting point.
Thank you. Yes, please
Can
go
I
ahead.
just follow up just on this question of entrepreneurship? We've done recently a randomized controlled trial on the case of entrepreneurship. It was a setting whereby we were giving behavioral science workshop to entrepreneurs. So both of them were kind of, there were two groups. One control was given, the behavioral, was given the exposure to behavioral science, and then had a workshop where they had to apply what they learned to real life challenges. And the other group was given the same exposure to behavioral science and then followed the workshop with only one difference. Some kind of a reminder similar to what Zeed done, but something very technical called retrieval practice, whereby it was behaviorally informed. So the entrepreneurs were kind of every 10 minutes or 15 minutes were asked one question about the competencies they learned in the last 10 minutes. And then both were given assessment at the end. Those with the behaviorally informed workshop scored 87% higher, and that was statistically significant. But what was amazing for both groups, after a 3-hour exposure to behavioral science and biases and nudges, they were cruising at high altitude with kind of these concepts and able to apply them to real life kind of challenges. So I think we're very encouraged by this initial kind of research. We've done it with a guy from LSE called Dario Kripan.
Thank you, Fadi. I'll give a chance to our panelists to give their concluding remarks. John?
Yeah, so I only know something, I guess, about fake news and stuff, so that's, I guess, what I'll talk about. So what we tried to do here was try to find a way to reach audiences that already know so much about, let's say, social media and online news consumption and things like that, that there isn't really anything a teacher can really say that'll, like, reach them, because it's pretty much impossible for a teacher to know more about, say, Snapchat than the actual people who use Snapchat every day of their lives, right? So I guess that's where this idea of putting the people in the position of the bad guy came from, which, you know, if you look at, let's say, the sales of video games like GTA, Grand Theft Auto, people like being the bad guy, so that was sort of our way to circumvent this idea of advertently or inadvertently coming off as quite patronizing when it comes to education efforts like this. So that, I guess, that is something we're still thinking about on, like, how to optimize things like that. It's just something I didn't get to say during my presentation.
Thank you, John. Mariam, anything you'd like to add?
Maybe I can say out loud a question that I often ask myself. This way everyone can be tormented like me with the idea. But the question is basically, like, where are we really headed with all this de-biasing, getting people to behave in very rational, homo economicus ways? Like, at the end of the day, in light of all the research that is being done also in evolutionary psychology, showing all the benefits of all these biases, actually, are we not heading towards, like, extremely rational societies? And with all the programming we're doing on AI and trying not to transfer the biases to AIs, are we not creating, like, a monstrous society that's going to take out all the charm of all the imperfectness that we all have? So this is something that sometimes I think of, and I wanted to share it.
Thank you, Mariam. Z, would you like to say?
I guess my closing remarks also kind of address one of the questions that was raised around teachers and some of their skepticism towards it. Often when we develop interventions, we develop alongside educators to make sure it's as fit for purpose as possible. But I guess the point that I really wanted to make is there's so much research now, and we've got so much more understanding about how people learn, the effective ways of teaching. Can we, and the real challenge to all of us, how can we start to introduce that into practice as much as possible, and really start to embed that in our practice? And the point was made, and I think it's absolutely right. There are good teachers know special techniques around these behavioral science stuff. They may not label it as such, but they know it's there. I guess what we're trying to do is really capture those insights and being able to disseminate those and test them as widely as possible so that I guess we can equip educators and teachers all around the world with these same insights so that the benefits of the learning in one area can be shared across and so that we can boost attainment across the world with these insights. So again, we welcome the challenge, but I also sort of put the challenge to the rest of you to go, we're all part of this journey together.
Thank you. Thank you.
You know, it's not working. My pet peeve is contextualization. You know, there is a lot of research is going on in the world, but I think we need to have research that is in the context where the learning is taking place, and research that is meaningful and based on need. I think one of the exciting things about behavioral insights is that it starts from the need, and that's, I think, where it can contribute a lot of education. There is a lot of research, but context is a very important factor to consider when you're doing this type of research.
Thank you so much. I mean, we've skipped. Would you like to say anything, Lauren?
I appreciate that this panel began by rooting us in reality, and
Yeah.
so thank you. And because there are some challenges in applying BI to this space, some things still to be figured out, I think it's worth it. When you talk about sustainable development, poverty reduction, reducing inequality, and some of the big challenges that our world faces, boy, this is one of the big areas where we can really make a difference. So I think that it's time and effort well spent.
Thank you. So please join me in giving our great panelists a round of applause. And thank you for being a great audience. Thank you.